It started as most bad ideas, down with a late-night scroll through the internet. Mia had stumbled upon an obscure forum dedicated to urban legends and stumbled across a thread titled The 5 Candles Ritual. The instructions were simple. Light 5 candles in a circle, ask questions to the spirits, and allegedly receive answers. It sounded ridiculous and thrilling, the perfect recipe for a Friday night with her friends. Mia was the ringleader of their small group, her curiosity always driving them into strange situations. Her best friend, Alex, was the skeptic, rolling his eyes at every ghost story but still tagging along. Then there was Tessa, who pretended to be brave but had a tendency to jump at her own shadow. And Caleb, the quiet one who'd go along with anything as long as it meant he didn't have to stay home. Together they formed a tight-knit group, their weekends often filled with dares, pranks, and now, apparently, rituals. "This is so stupid," Alex muttered as they gathered in Mia's dimly lit basement. The room had a low ceiling, cluttered shelves, and a faint smell of mildew that only added to the eerie atmosphere. "It'll be fun," Mia replied, setting up the candles in a perfect circle on the cold concrete floor. "Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Nothing, because it's fake." "That's what they always say in horror movies," Tessa said, her voice wavering as she glanced around the room. "And then everyone ends up dead." "Oh, come on," Caleb said with a rare grin. "You're not scared, are you?" "No," Tessa replied quickly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Mia struck a match and lit the first candle, the tiny flame casting flickering shadows on the walls. One by one, she lit the rest, and the group sat cross-legged around the circle. The basement felt heavier now, the silence pressing against them, as if the room itself were holding its breath. "Okay, so what do we do?" Alex asked, leaning back on his hands. "We're supposed to ask questions," Mia said, pulling out her phone to reread the instructions. "The spirits answer by making the flames flicker. Simple." "Fine," Alex said with a sigh. He leaned forward, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the candles. "Is there anyone here with us?" The flames remained steady. "See? Nothing," he said, sitting back with a smirk. "Maybe you have to be more specific," Tessa said, her eyes darting nervously between the candles. "Okay," Mia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If there are any spirits here, give us a sign." The candle's flames quivered, just slightly. Everyone froze. "Did you see that?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "It's probably just a draft," Alex said, though he shifted uncomfortably. Mia's eyes gleamed with excitement. "Let's keep going. Who are you?" The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. One of the candles flickered wildly, then steadied. "This is freaky," Tessa whispered, rubbing her arms as if to ward off a sudden chill. "Do you mean us harm?" Caleb asked, surprising everyone. He rarely spoke during their escapades, and the question hung in the air like a weight. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, one of the candles went out. Tessa let out a yelp, and Alex scrambled back, knocking over a stack of old books. "What the hell?" he exclaimed. "Did you blow it out?" Mia asked, her voice sharp as she looked at Caleb, who shook his head vehemently. "I didn't touch it," he said. The room grew colder still, the temperature dropping so fast that their breaths began to mist in the faint light. The remaining candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing as if caught in an invisible wind. "We should stop," Tessa said, her voice high-pitched with panic. "We should stop right now." Mia hesitated, but before she could respond, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Everyone jumped, their eyes darting toward the door. "Who did that?" Alex demanded, his bravado crumbling. "It wasn't me," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. A low hum filled the air, growing louder until it was a deep, vibrating drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The shadows on the walls twisted and stretched, elongating unnaturally. "Blow out the candles," Tessa pleaded, her hands trembling as she reached for one of the flames. "Don't," Mia snapped, grabbing her wrist. "We don't know what will happen if we blow them all out." But it was too late. In her panic, Tessa had already exhaled, extinguishing the flame. The hum stopped. Silence enveloped the room, so absolute it felt suffocating. Then, slowly, The remaining candles began to dim, their light shrinking until the basement was plunged into near darkness. "Do you see that?" Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. Everyone turned to look where he was pointing. In the corner of the room, a shadow darker than the rest seemed to shift and writhe, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape. "Oh my God," Tessa breathed, clutching Alex's arm. The shadow moved, stepping closer, its presence oppressive and overwhelming. The final candle flickered weakly, then went out, leaving them in pitch blackness. And then the screaming began. It was chaos in the dark. Tessa's screams mingled with Alex's frantic cursing, and the sound of someone stumbling echoed through the basement. Mia fumbled for her phone, desperate for any source of light, but her fingers felt numb and clumsy. When she finally managed to turn on the flashlight, the beam illuminated the room and the shadow. It stood at the edge of the circle, its form vaguely human but disturbingly distorted. The head tilted unnaturally to one side, and the edges of its body seemed to flicker, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. The air around it was suffocatingly cold, and an overwhelming sense of dread seeped into every corner of the room. "What is that?" Caleb's voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. "I don't know," Mia whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from the figure. This wasn't supposed to happen." "No kidding," Alex snapped, his voice cracking. "How do we make it stop?" Mia's mind raced, but she couldn't think straight. The instructions hadn't mentioned anything like this. The forum had been vague, almost playful, about the ritual's outcomes. Gripping her chest. "The circle isn't complete without them." "Are you insane?" Alex shot back. "I'm not going near that thing." "Do you have a better idea?" Mia snapped, her voice rising. Before anyone could respond, the shadow moved again, stepping fully into the circle. The temperature in the room plummeted further, and the oppressive hum returned, low and menacing. Caleb let out a strangled cry and backed into the wall, his hands clawing at the cold concrete, as if trying to escape through it. "We're running out of time," Mia said, grabbing the matches from the floor. Her hands shook as she struck one, the tiny flame sputtering to life. She leaned forward to light the nearest candle, but just as the wick caught fire, a sudden gust of icy wind extinguished it. The shadow seemed to grow taller, its form looming over her. "Mia, don't," Tessa begged, tears streaming down her face. "What if it gets angry?" "It's already angry," Mia shot back, crawling to the next candle. She tried again, shielding the match with her hand, and this time the flame held. One candle down, 4 to go. The shadow let out, a low, guttural sound that resonated deep in their chests. Alex pulled Tessa back, positioning himself between her and the figure, though his shaking hands betrayed his fear. "Hurry up," he yelled, his voice cracking. Mia scrambled to the next candle, lighting it with trembling hands. The room seemed to shift around them, the walls warping and bending as if the basement itself were coming alive. The shadow darted toward her, its movement unnervingly fast. But as the second candle flared to life, it recoiled slightly, its form flickering. "It's working," Caleb said, his voice hoarse. "Keep going." Mia crawled to the third candle, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The matchbox slipped from her fingers, and she let out a frustrated cry as she fumbled to retrieve it. The shadow seized the opportunity, closing the distance between them. She could feel its presence pressing against her, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. "Mia!" Tessa screamed. But before the shadow could reach her, Alex lunged forward, throwing the books from the overturned stack at it. The distraction was enough to give Mia a moment to light the third candle. Again, the shadow recoiled, its form flickering violently as if it were being torn apart. With renewed determination, Mia lit the fourth candle. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening, and the shadow's movements became erratic. It thrashed within the circle, its form splintering and reforming, as if it were fighting to stay whole. "One more," Mia whispered, crawling to the final candle. Her hands were numb, her fingers barely able to hold the match. She struck it once, twice, and on the third try, the flame ignited. She leaned forward, shielding it with her body, and lit the fifth candle. The moment the flame caught, the hum stopped. The shadow let out an ear-splitting wail, its form collapsing in on itself. The candles flared brightly, their light searing, and then everything went dark. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by their ragged breaths. Slowly, Mia turned on her phone's flashlight. The shadow was gone, and the basement looked normal again, though the candles were nothing but melted wax puddles on the floor. "Is it over?" Tessa asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mia nodded, though she didn't feel as confident as she looked. "I think so." But as they climbed the stairs and left the basement behind, none of them noticed the faint, dark stain on the concrete floor where the shadow had stood, slowly spreading outward. The old tome smelled of mildew and dust, its leather cover cracked from years of neglect. Amanda ran her fingers over the embossed title, Rituals of the Forgotten Ones. She had found the book in a dim corner of a second-hand shop, its price tag handwritten in shaky letters. Desperation drove her to buy it. After months of grieving for her husband, Daniel, who had died in a car accident, Amanda would try anything to ease the ache in her chest of the bizarre ritual described on page 113. Take dried flowers from a loved one's funeral, the instructions read. Amanda had saved the withered bouquet from Daniel's casket, unable to part with it. The petals, once white lilies and pale roses, had browned and curled, fragile as old parchment. Burn them under the full moon, the text continued, and whisper the words, "Return what is gone." Amanda glanced at the calendar. The full moon would rise that very night, its timing feeling eerily deliberate, as if fate itself had arranged the ritual's stage. The book's final warning, written in faded ink, was easy to overlook in her grief-stricken state. Beware what returns is not what was lost. That evening, Amanda prepared the ritual. She gathered the brittle flowers and placed them in a metal bowl on her backyard patio. The moon loomed overhead, its light unnaturally bright, casting elongated shadows across the lawn. The air felt heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. She lit a match and set the flowers ablaze. They caught quickly, their brittle petals curling into ash as an acrid, sweet scent wafted up. Heart-pounding, Amanda whispered the words, "Return what is gone." Her voice quivered, barely louder than the crackle of burning flowers. The flames flickered, casting eerie, shifting shapes on the walls of her house. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the fire, leaving the bowl's contents blackened and cold. The night grew still. No sound of crickets, no distant hum of cars, just silence, thick and suffocating. Amanda lingered for a moment, expecting something, but nothing happened. Disappointment mixed with guilt settled in her chest. What had she expected? Magic? Miracles? She sighed and carried the bowl inside, setting it on the kitchen table. Exhausted, she went to bed, tears dampening her pillow. Morning brought an unsettling surprise. When Amanda walked into the kitchen, she froze. There, on the table, sat the flowers. Not the brittle remains she had burned, but fresh blooms, vibrant and fragrant, as if they'd just been plucked. The lilies gleamed white, their petals soft to the touch, and the rose's crimson hue was almost unnatural in its intensity. Amanda's breath hitched. She stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. "No," she whispered. Her mind raced for an explanation. Had she dreamed the ritual? Was this some cruel prank? But then her eyes shifted to the faint burn marks on the table, proof that the fire had been real. As she stared at the flowers, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A shadow loomed behind the bouquet, tall and distorted. Amanda's blood ran cold as the shadow stepped forward, resolving into a figure. Her heart clenched. It was Daniel. Or at least, it looked like him. His features were familiar, the strong jawline, the crooked smile she had loved so much, but something was off. His eyes, once warm and full of life, were now dark and glassy, like pools of ink. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his movements were stiff, almost mechanical. "Amanda," he said, his voice low and hollow. It echoed unnaturally, as if coming from a great distance. Amanda's legs gave out, and she collapsed into a chair, trembling. "Daniel?" she whispered, barely able to speak. Tears blurred her vision. Is it really you? He tilted his head, his smile widening into something that sent a shiver down her spine. You called for me, he said. I'm here. Amanda reached out, her hand trembling. But as her fingers grazed his, she recoiled. His skin was ice cold, the texture wrong, too smooth, too rigid, like porcelain. What are you? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel's smile faltered, his expression darkening. You don't recognize me? He asked, his tone sharp, almost accusatory. You brought me back. Amanda's mind screamed at her to run, to get away from this thing that wore her husband's face. But she couldn't move, paralyzed by fear and confusion. This isn't right, she said, shaking her head. You're not him. Daniel's expression twisted into something monstrous. His features seemed to ripple, his skin bubbling and stretching unnaturally. His once familiar face warped, his eyes sinking deeper into their sockets, his mouth elongating into a grotesque grin. You wanted me back, he snarled, his voice a guttural growl. And now I'm here. Amanda screamed, stumbling to her feet and backing away. But the shadowy figure, no longer resembling Daniel in any way, advanced, its movements jerky and inhuman. The flowers on the table began to wither, their vibrant colors draining away, as if consumed by the dark presence in the room. A sudden knock at the front door broke the tension. Amanda's head snapped toward the sound, her heart hammering. She turned back to the shadow, but it was gone. The room was empty, the flowers reduced to a pile of ash. Her hands shook as she approached the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but the empty street. Slowly, she opened the door, the morning sunlight spilling in. On the porch lay a single white lily, fresh and dewy, as if it had just been picked. Amanda's chest tightened. She backed away, slamming the door shut. But when she turned around, the kitchen table was no longer empty. The flowers were back, vibrant and whole, and the air was heavy with their cloying scent. Amanda's legs gave out as the shadow reappeared behind the bouquet, taller and more distorted than before. The sound of her own heartbeat roared in her ears as the shadow whispered, "You cannot undo what you've done." Amanda barely slept that night. Every creak of the house made her flinch. Every shadow seemed alive. She kept her bedroom door locked, but it offered little comfort. The image of the shadowy figure and the fresh flowers haunted her, looping endlessly in her mind. She didn't dare go back to the kitchen. When dawn finally broke, Amanda ventured out of her room cautiously. The house was eerily silent, the air heavy and oppressive. Her stomach churned as she peeked into the kitchen. The flowers were gone, replaced by an empty, scorched table. Relief flooded her momentarily, but it was short-lived. As she brewed coffee, a faint whisper brushed her ear. "Amanda." The cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the tiled floor. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her breath quickened, and she clutched the counter for support. The voice had been unmistakable. It was Daniel's. She couldn't stay here. Amanda grabbed her keys and fled the house, not bothering to lock the door. She drove aimlessly, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching her. Eventually, she found herself at the cemetery where Daniel was buried. His grave was well kept, the headstone polished and adorned with fresh flower lilies and roses, just like the ones that had appeared on her table. Her legs felt like lead as she approached. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence was deafening. When she reached the grave, she froze. The flowers weren't just fresh, they were the exact same bouquet she had burned during the ritual. Amanda's mind raced. How could they be here? Had someone dug them up? But the soil around the grave was undisturbed. "You shouldn't have done it," a voice rasped behind her. Amanda whipped around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't have called me back." Her knees buckled, and she fell to the ground. The world seemed to tilt, the shadows around her deepening unnaturally. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and incoherent, until they became a deafening roar. Amanda screamed, covering her ears, but the noise was inside her head. Fragments of words. "Not him," "a doorway," "can't close it." And then, silence. Amanda opened her eyes to find herself alone. The graveyard was still, bathed in pale morning light. She stumbled to her feet and fled, her heart racing. But as she reached her car, she saw it. A figure stood in the distance, near the tree line. It was Daniel, or what looked like him, watching her with those dark, glassy eyes. The next few days were a blur of terror. Amanda couldn't escape the feeling that she was being followed. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Whispers echoed through the house, and the scent of lilies and roses lingered no matter how many windows she opened. Answers, flipping past rituals and warnings she had ignored the first time. Finally, she found a section titled Reversing the Unnatural. The instructions were vague, written in cryptic language, but one line stood out: to sever the tie, offer what was taken, and abandon the tether. Amanda's hands trembled. She interpreted it to mean she had to return the flowers, but where? And what was the tether? She searched her memory, piecing together every detail of the ritual. The flowers, the fire, the words she had spoken. It all pointed back to the place where it began. That night, she prepared for the reversal. She retrieved the flowers from the table, now dry and brittle again, and placed them in the same metal bowl. The full moon was gone, replaced by a thin crescent, but Amanda couldn't wait another month. She carried the bowl to the backyard, her breath visible in the cold night air. "To sever the tie," she whispered, her voice cracking. She lit a match and dropped it into the bowl. The flowers burned quickly, the flames dancing higher than before. The air grew thick, pressing against her chest. Amanda choked on the smoke, which swirled unnaturally, forming shapes that flickered at the edge of her vision. "Offer what was taken," she said, her voice barely audible. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Daniel's wedding ring, the only piece of him she had kept after his death. Tears streamed down her face as she dropped it into the fire. The flames roared, turning from orange to an unnatural blue. The shapes in the smoke solidified, forming grotesque faces that screamed silently. Amanda fell to her knees, shielding her eyes. The wind howled, whipping around her violently, and then, as quickly as it started, the fire died. When Amanda looked up, the bowl was empty. The flowers, the ring, everything had vanished. The air was still. The oppressive weight lifted. She stood shakily, looking around. The backyard was silent, the shadows no longer menacing. For the first time in days, Amanda felt a glimmer of hope. She turned to go back inside, but froze. There in the doorway stood Daniel. He looked more human now, his features softer, his eyes less dark, but he was still wrong. He didn't belong here. "Amanda," he said, his voice calm but hollow, "you can't undo this." Before she could react, he stepped forward, his hand reaching for her. Amanda screamed and stumbled back, tripping over the empty bowl. She scrambled to her feet and ran inside, slamming the door behind her. The windows rattled as the wind picked up again, the shadows outside swirling violently. Amanda locked herself in the bathroom, her chest heaving. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the pale, wide-eyed woman staring back. The whispers began again, faint but persistent. "Return what is gone. Return what is gone." Amanda's heart sank as she realized the truth. The ritual couldn't be undone. She had opened a door, and it would never close. Outside, the wind howled, and the scent of lilies filled the air once more. It started on a cold October night, the kind of night when the wind whispers secrets through the trees, and the moon hides behind a veil of clouds. Emily sat cross-legged on the carpet of her best friend, Rachel's dimly lit room. The group of 4 girls, Emily, Rachel, Jenna, and Sophie had, spent the evening swapping ghost stories. But Rachel, always the bold one, wanted something more. "Let's do it," Rachel said, her green eyes sparkling with mischief. "Let's see our future reflections." Jenna rolled her eyes. "That's just a dumb urban legend." Sophie nervously fiddled with her bracelet. "Maybe we shouldn't. What if something bad happens?" But Emily, caught between skepticism and curiosity, found herself nodding along with Rachel's enthusiasm. It was harmless fun, right? What could go wrong? Rachel grabbed a thick, dusty book from her bookshelf. "I read about it in here," she said, flipping through the pages until she found the right one. "It's simple. You light a candle, stand in front of a mirror and say these words. She cleared her throat dramatically. Show me what is yet to be. Let me see what's meant for me. Then you wait. Emily hesitated. And what's supposed to happen? Rachel shrugged. Your reflection moves on its own and shows you your future. Or nothing happens and we all get a good laugh. After a round of dares and cajoling, it was Emily who ended up volunteering. Her heart raced as Rachel handed her a stubby white candle and guided her to the full-length mirror leaning against the wall. The other girls sat on the bed, watching with bated breath. Emily lit the candle, the flame casting flickering shadows across her face. She stared at her reflection, her own wide brown eyes staring back, the light painting ghostly shapes in the mirror's surface. She whispered the words, "Show me what is yet to be. Let me see what's meant for me." At first, nothing happened. The silence in the room stretched thin, broken only by the sound of the candle's faint crackle. Emily exhaled, half relieved, half disappointed. See? Nothing. When her reflection blinked, Emily froze. She hadn't blinked. The version of herself in the mirror was staring straight at her, unblinking and unbroken, while she stood paralyzed. "Guys," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you see that?" The other girls leaned forward, their faces pale. "It's probably just a trick of the light," Rachel said, but her voice wavered. The reflection began to move, slowly at first, lifting its arm and tilting its head. But Emily hadn't moved an inch. The mirror. Emily's lips curled into a smirk, one that was both familiar and foreign. Then it spoke. "I liked you," it said, the voice raspy and low, nothing like Emily's own. "Now you are mine." Emily stumbled back, the candle nearly falling from her hand. The flame flickered wildly, but it didn't go out. The reflection reached a hand toward the glass, pressing its palm against the surface. Emily's stomach churned as the glass rippled like water. "Blow out the candle!" Sophie screamed. But Emily's hands were trembling too much to react. She watched in horror as her reflection began to climb out of the mirror, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on frayed strings. The room grew colder, the air heavy with the scent of burnt hair. The lights overhead flickered, then died, plunging the girls into near darkness. Only the candle's glow remained, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Emily, get away from it!" Jenna shouted. But Emily couldn't move. The reflection was halfway out now, its features warped and wrong. Its eyes were too dark, its smile too wide. Finally, Rachel lunged forward and grabbed the candle from Emily's hand. She blew it out with one frantic breath, and the room was plunged into pitch black. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the sound of scraping, like nails on a chalkboard. The girls huddled together, their breathing shallow. Emily's heart thundered in her chest as she whispered, "Is it gone?" A low chuckle echoed through the room. "You can't get rid of me that easily," the voice rasped. The girls screamed as the mirror shattered, shards of glass flying across the room. In the fractured pieces scattered on the floor, Emily could still see the reflection's face, staring back at her from 1,000 angles. "What do we do?" Sophie cried, tears streaming down her face. Rachel grabbed the book, frantically flipping through the pages. There has to be something in here, a way to reverse it. But before she could find anything, the room seemed to twist around them. The walls bent inward, the ceiling stretched higher, and the air grew thick and suffocating. The shards of glass began to vibrate, the reflections within them moving independently, their mouths opening in silent screams. Emily felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. "Please stop this," she begged, but the voice only laughed. "You invited me," it said, "and now I'm here to stay." The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The girls scrambled toward it, pounding and screaming, but it wouldn't budge. The reflection's laughter filled the room, echoing off the warped walls. Rachel's hands shook as she read from the book. "To banish the reflection, you must," her voice faltered, "you must sacrifice something pure." All eyes turned to Sophie, the youngest and most innocent among them. She shook her head violently. "No, I'm not. I can't." Before anyone could react, the reflection's arm shot out from a shard of glass. grabbing Sophie by the wrist. She screamed as it began to pull her toward the mirror's remains. "Help me!" she cried, but the others were frozen in terror. Emily, shaking with adrenaline, grabbed the candle and held the flame to the shard. The glass hissed and cracked, and the reflection let out an ear-piercing shriek. The room seemed to implode, the walls snapping back into place, the air returning to normal. The mirror was gone, reduced to nothing but ash, and the reflection was nowhere to be seen. The girls sat in stunned silence, their faces pale and streaked with tears. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We should never have done this." Emily nodded, her hands still trembling. "It's over now, right?" But deep down, she wasn't sure, because in the corner of her eye, just for a moment, she thought she saw her reflection move.